According to a report by the United Nations Environment Programme, which shows that greenhouse gas emissions reached a new high last year. The annual emissions gap report measures the gap between anticipated emissions and those consistent with limiting the global temperature rise this century, as agreed in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Under the Global Climate Pact, countries have committed to a long-term goal of limiting the average temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. They have further committed to pursue efforts to limit to even a further 1.5 degrees Celsius. Earlier, I spoke to the head of climate policy and planning at the UN Environmental Programme DTU Partnership, and OLHOFF, and she highlighted the key findings of the latest emissions gap report.
Well, this year I think it has three sort of headline messages. And this year's report comes 5 years after we agreed on the Paris Agreement back in Paris in 2015. And the first key message, as I see it, is that in that time, in those 5 years, we actually haven't managed to reduce the emissions gap.
What do you think has been holding us back in reaching the goals?
Well, I mean, the main problem, of course, is that the climate ambitions that most countries have set are simply insufficient. What we look at in the report are the climate targets that countries have set for 2030 under the UN Climate Convention. And basically, what we see in the report is that those climate commitments reduce global emissions by between 4 to 9%. But what we do need by 2030 is reductions in global emissions that are in the order of more than 25 and more than 55% if we want to get on track to the Paris Agreement temperature goal.
Everybody seemed committed in Paris at the Paris Agreement. Where's the gap between the commitment and the action? We've seen recently that changes in political power can swing things quite a bit. Is that been part of the problem?
I think what we've seen this year, apart from all the disruption caused by Corona crisis and so forth, we've also seen some very positive signs. A lot of new countries, including some of the major emitters, have announced net zero emissions goals around the middle of this century. And that's sort of the type of long-term goals that we need if we want to get on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Of course, it doesn't help just to announce this goal. It has to be backed up by policies, by action, and it has to be backed up by that action now. It's simply going to be too late if countries wait until 2030, for instance, before thinking about how to go about it in practice. But it's very encouraging to see this increase in net zero goals for the middle of the century. Currently, we have about just over half of global emissions covered by such goals. And if the USA also joins the wagon, so to speak, and commits to net zero goal as indicated in the president-elect's climate plan, then that share will be 63% of global emissions. So that's a really important development. It's going to help us very much in terms of getting on track, provided that it's backed up by action and that the countries actually achieve these goals.
When we look at Africa, in comparison, the continent is not a mad emitter compared to other developing and developed nations. And yet Africa in many ways is very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and we're seeing in droughts. And I just wonder, how does one go about equalizing this, that we are punished and yet as a continent we're not contributing as much as the big emitters to the problem?
That is a very important and difficult question to answer. So we've seen under the climate change negotiations how difficult it is for countries to agree on what are fair shares. How do we make sure that countries who haven't contributed to this problem are compensated, and also that we minimize the impact in these countries? Of course, what's really important is that the major emitters simply need to take, I think, a larger step in terms of reducing emissions than the smaller emitters. That's where it counts overall in the global picture. And then if we look, of course, the most important thing is to actually reduce emissions, because if we continue the current path leading to huge increases in temperature, that will also mean huge increases in extreme events and devastating impacts for populations all around the world, but not least on the African continent. So reducing emissions is the first step, and then we need to find out how countries can be supported, both in terms of technical advice and so forth, but also financially in actually adjusting to the climate changes that we cannot avoid.
Is it still possible to reach the target for 2030? I think it's 5 degrees that we need to reach. Is it still possible, or is it getting too late?
It's still possible, but we need to act now. We need to act every year from now to 2030 to get on track to the Paris Agreement goal of keeping global temperature well below 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5 degrees. What the report shows this year, and also did last year, is basically if we don't manage to reduce emissions significantly by 2030, we can forget about 1.5 degrees. And it will become increasingly difficult to limit temperature increase to below 2 degrees as well. So we need to act now. One of the big things this year, of course, is the whole COVID-19 crisis, and also the enormous sums of money that's floating into rescue and recovery packages, especially, I would say, then in the higher income group of countries. And if that money is spent wisely, accelerating a green transition, then I believe we can make real progress also before 2030.
All right, and then coming back to Africa again, people talk about green, whereas in many parts of the continent, people are talking about survival. Is there an economic story about trying to make this transition to green, even though it might be more expensive for us as a continent in the short term?
I think things are changing very rapidly also when we look at the economic side. So maybe 10 years ago it was true that it was more expensive, but actually now that's no longer the case. In most parts of the world, it's actually cheaper to build the energy sector around renewable energy than it is to stay on fossil fuels. So the good thing is that we've seen a massive acceleration in the cost declines of renewable energy, in new solutions to a number of problems that will make it easier and cheaper for most countries to actually create a better future.
All right. And then perhaps finally, when you look at this report, what is the message that you would like to leave our viewers with as perhaps the most important to take cognizance of?
Well, I would say the most important is we need to act now. And by we, it's everybody. We can all do something to reduce the human footprint on the global planet. We need also to use this opening that is passed on to us by the huge investments made in COVID-19 economic recovery to really accelerate a green transition. Otherwise, the Paris Agreement goals might slip out of reach.
That was the head of climate policy and planning at UNEP DTU Partnership, Anne OLHOFF, speaking to me a little earlier.